So welcome everybody and thank you for joining us for the black carbon measurement webinar. Do you want to go to the next slide, Ryan? So we've got a panel of people here today. So we've got Jeff Blair, the President and CEO of AethLabs, Dr. Stig Hellebust, a lecturer in physical chemistry at the University of Cork, Ivan Iskra, Business Development Lead for AethLabs, and myself, Lee Swanson, the Regional Account Manager for Clarity. So we're going to talk about the black carbon module that's been developed by AethLabs, and Clarity is working in partnership with AethLabs. And I'll hand you over to Jeff Blair, who's going to go through AethLabs input.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So excited to have this opportunity to give you a little bit of background and a little bit of a story about our company and what we do. I'm going to tell you a little bit about AethLabs and our technology, kind of transition into talking about our collaboration with Clarity for the BC module and the integration with the Clarity node. And then you'll hear from others about applications and more about the EU directives a little bit later on. So next slide, please. First off, I just want to thank all of our partners and collaborators over the years who've really helped to make this possible, whether it's field deployments or funding from government agencies, collaborations with universities and academics who've really helped validate this our technology. We're exceedingly grateful to everyone. Next, please. So a little bit about black carbon. These particles are really small. They come from combustion. Typically, fresh combustion particles are very, very small, in the tens of nanometers. And then they grow to become larger chains of molecules or particles and agglomerate into these larger sizes. They're typically less than 1 micron in diameter, very, very small. And one of the key properties in terms of our technology is that they absorb light. And so we exploit that in order to make our measurement. Recently, if you look at the literature, you also see black carbon referred to as kind of this super pollutant. And that's because of the health and climate impacts that it's known for. And we'll get into a little bit of that in upcoming slides. Next. So a little bit about the sources of black carbon. So there are natural sources, of course, in terms of wildfires, burning, and things of that nature. And then, of course, sources from humans in terms of fossil fuel burning, transportation. We often think of power generation, but it turns out power generation emissions are actually relatively small by comparison, as you can see in the chart in the top right-hand corner. But in terms of these sources, I think one of the interesting things in terms of trends is that at least in the US and parts of Europe, wildfires, which are exacerbated by climate change and becoming more prevalent, as we all have seen in the news, is becoming a much more important source. And in terms of health impacts, is also becoming more and more significant. Next, please. So in terms of health effects, you can think of one of those single black carbon spherules and think of it as, kind of a graphitic carbon soot particle, but then it gets coated with these secondary organics and toxics and metals, the kinds of things that do make their way deep into the lungs. If you breathe one of these tiny, tiny particles, it gets very, very deep, sometimes actually passing through into the bloodstream directly. And so these other materials are actually, will cause irritation. Sometimes that leads to, obviously cancer and other respiratory diseases, or inflammation in other parts of the body, the brain, the heart, organs and things like that, ultimately leading to premature death. I think we've all heard about PM 2.5 and the associations in terms of premature deaths worldwide. Some estimates are, 6 to 7 million annually. But BC specifically is, can make up between, up to 25% of PM 2.5 mass. And because of these toxics, there's definitely literature pointing to correlation, stronger correlations between BC exposure and health effects. There's not a lot in the literature actually directly linking BC to premature death, but there have been a few papers, and there's one in 2016 that focused on the US, but found that 14,000 annual deaths were specifically from BC in 2010 alone. Next slide, please. Okay, so climate effects. I was just talking about health. In terms of climate, as I said before, black carbon, these particles absorb light. And so you might think of some of the terms that are used to describe light-absorbing carbonaceous particles. You might hear of elemental carbon, organic carbon, black carbon, brown carbon, light-absorbing carbon. Turns out that these terms really are method dependent. So depending on the type of instrumentation used to make the measurement, there's different terminology and different kind of understandings and limitations in terms of those definitions. But because these particles all absorb light, they do impact the climate. So up to 65% of the total impact in terms of climate forcing compared to CO2. So that kind of makes it the #2 most important climate agent. And because these particles do have a little bit more mass than carbon dioxide, which is a gas, obviously, the particles have a limited lifetime in the atmosphere, and so they end up kind of precipitating to the ground over time. Next. So I also mentioned a little bit about wildfires. And this is one of those trends that I think we will see more and more of in upcoming years as we find ourselves in drier and drier climates around the world, it really exacerbating the frequency and unfortunately the magnitude of wildfires. And so we're actually seeing some increases in terms of the ratio of black carbon to total PM 2.5. And so different sources will have different ratios, but that potentially means that those toxics that surround those particles, the secondary organics, the metals that I mentioned, are becoming potentially more prevalent and impacting a wider, having more regional effects as opposed to, say, local effects from a power plant or a freeway or something like that. Next, please. So a little bit about AethLabs. We're really focused on impact. We have been working for the past 10 to 15 years on developing smaller, more portable, more cost-effective instrumentation for measuring black carbon. And our desire to have impact and to really make more and more measurements is one of the main reasons why we decided to partner with Clarity to try to get the black carbon monitoring technology out there in the world and really have impact in terms of adding this measurement and making it in lots of different places. Next, please. So we've been around since 2011. Like I said, we make these small devices, but one of the interesting things that we can do with our technology is that a number of our instruments can distinguish between biomass burning and fossil fuel. So we can do some source apportionment on the data to try to help determine what is the fuel that's actually being burned. And that is important in terms of interventions. So, if you need to understand, are you having your emissions, are they coming from traffic? Are they coming from agricultural burning? Are they wildfire related? Are they from solid fuel burning, for residential heating, for example? And you'll hear more about that in some of the upcoming slides. Next, please. The aethalometer technology, it was developed in the 80s by Tony Hansen at the Berkeley National Lab and later turned into a number of versions of the rack mount aethalometer, which some of you may be familiar with. Next, please. We started out with a portable device, the A51, that blue box, which London Mayor Sadiq Khan is holding in this lovely photo. You'll also see the mayor with the Clarity node in the image to the left. I love these two photos. But we released this device in the late 2000s, and we've been making it ever since. Next. So a little bit about how this works. So we have a filter that we actually collect particles on. So we have a vacuum pump and we pull air into the instrument, we collect it on that filter, but instead of then taking that filter back to the laboratory for an integrated analysis, we actually have light sources and detectors, and we're able to measure the rate of change of the darkening of the filter due to the light absorbing particles. And so that's the basic principle that we use for our measurement. Next. We also share a patented technology with some of the more expensive rack mount equipment. So we employ the dual spot method, which is a patented technique that actually compensates the instrument for kind of physical limitations of the method. So at higher loadings, when we have more and more particles collected on that filter that I mentioned, sometimes there can be errors depending on those coatings. So depending on the optical properties of those particles, the response of the technology can change a little bit. And so this patented approach, as you can see in the top chart there, you can see the data in black. You'd want that to actually look more like a curve. And these are relatively high loadings, 8 to 10 micrograms per cubic meter of black carbon. And in the bottom, you can see that the method actually corrects for those decreasing trends in the data. And so that's built into our MA series devices, MA350, MA200, and also included in the Clarity, the module that we make for Clarity. And this is akin to the same type of approach that's used in much more expensive rack mount instrumentation that's deployed in regulatory monitoring facilities around the world. Next slide. Going to touch really quickly on BC standardization efforts in Europe. So there is this project called Stand BC, and we've been involved with it this year. And the intent there is really to create traceability for measuring equivalent black carbon. There aren't any reference materials or reference methods yet. And so there is this effort underway to create a chain of calibration so that if you're using a personal monitor like the devices that we make, you can have a calibration chain to an actual reference standard and try to reduce the uncertainties of all the black carbon measurements that are out there in the field. So this is a really great effort that you'll probably hear about more if you're involved in making BC measurements. But I just wanted to touch on that because it really is an important advancement in terms of just data quality and measurement reliability across, around the world, basically. Next. I mentioned rack mount instrumentation. So just in terms of our technology, the MA350, we really tried to take the top of the line rack mount instrumentation and squish it down into a very small form factor. So we've included all the major features of the rack mount instrumentation in our device, MA350 and MA200, and as well as the Clarity module, which is based off of the MA350 technology. We've also added, other technologies, sensors and things like that to our small package there. But if we go on to the next slide, I can show you a little bit of data. So I talked about source apportionment. In the top right-hand corner, you can see that we have 3 traces. We've got the black carbon in black, and that is typically measured at 880 nanometers in our device. And then there's the source apportionment that I mentioned in terms of being able to distinguish between biomass burning, which is in that gold color, and fossil fuel in blue. And there will be some more slides later on that I think Clarity is presenting, so I won't get into data too much, but that just gives an example of the speciation that we can provide. So we break down that black total kind of black carbon measurement and then apportion it to different sources, which is really helpful. Next slide. Early validation. So the MA350 technology was actually developed under a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency grant, and I guess 8 to 10 years ago at this point. And some of the earliest validation work was done at the EPA comparing to photoacoustic methods and other instrumentation such as the rack mount AE33, the aethalometer, with good agreement and that was a really helpful collaboration as well. Next slide. So again, just some points on the technology. The dual spot correction technology is unique to the aethalometer and microath technology. That's our implementation of the dual spot, and that is just actively correcting for the differing optical properties of particles that come from different fuel sources. There's consistency in terms of the MA350 measurement in reference to the AE33 aethalometer, and that's been shown time and time again in terms of peer-reviewed publication. You'll see some more charts from some of the Clarity slides. So there's actually a lot of material out there comparing MA350 to the AE33 with really good results. Quite happy about that. Next slide, please. Just a couple of examples of literature over the past 7-8 years, and MA deployments, typically MA200 and MA350, in comparison to the AE33. So I think all of these charts here, you'll see MA350 on one axis, AE33 in the other, and you can see the scatter in terms of the agreement, typically within 10 to 15% of the AE33. Next slide. Again, this is some of the same material just in terms of source apportionment, so I think we'll go to the next slide. And then I want to touch on some validation work that was done in France. There's a 3-year campaign with collaborating with our partners, our representatives in France, ADAIR, who I think are on the call today, or on the webinar today. And so there is a network of AE33s, the rack mount instrument in France, and it's really important in terms of understanding sources in France and other countries, obviously, just in terms of biomass burning, heating, and versus traffic emissions. And so we were trying to figure out, we were collaborating with regional air quality management agencies to deploy MA350s side by side with AE33s to do some comparisons and see if the MA350s could have utility in terms of expanding the network and making measurements, and being an alternative to the AE33. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the first results, this is just in Lyon, but here's 2 charts in terms of black carbon measurements: MA350 in blue, AE33 in red, scatter plots on the right. So if we go on to the next slide, you can see that the results of this 3-year campaign was that the MA350 was approved basically as equivalent to the AE33, and again, is approved for use in standard regulatory monitoring in France. And this is really a big deal for us because we've been working on this technology for over a decade, and to have this kind of recognition and demonstration of equivalence of our measurement to what's been considered, it's considered a reference method by many in terms of the AE33. This was really a validation of all of the effort and work over the past decade. You can find certificates in terms that discuss the approval. You can certainly get in touch with our colleagues at Clarity if you'd like a copy of that. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, if you see the term soot, that's typically really does mean black carbon. It's the light absorbing black carbonaceous particles. You don't typically see PM 2.5 on your windowsill or on the inside of your tailpipe of your car. You see black carbon, the carbonaceous particles. BC is just a part of PM 2.5. So out of all the particles in the air, BC is just a fraction of that. There's evidence pointing to it being to specifically causing a considerable amount of illness and death and disease, and that's important in terms of health. And it also has a big impact on the climate. There isn't any direct regulation yet, and hopefully that does change at some point, because if we invest more in our technology in terms of how we burn fuel, we should be able to have a significant impact in terms of reducing emissions, at least in certain industries or specific modes of transport. And then AethLabs, I've been doing this personally for 25 years, and in the form of the AethLabs as a company in the past since 2011. And we're really excited about what we think that this BC module in combination with the Clarity node can offer, for field measurements and for really creating insights in terms of understanding where that PM 2.5 where the sources are. So I believe that is my last slide. Thank you very much.
So now, we'll go on to Ivan, who's going to talk about the new EU policies into black carbon.
Thank you very much. First, can you just confirm you can hear me? Because I joined the call a little bit late. Okay, thank you. Yeah, just recently we were informed from the European Commission that there is a new legislation now that will come into action, probably just after confirming in all member states. European Union exists, but there are still, all member states needs to do, separate process in their countries, and then it will be also approved by every state in series of approvals. So the new directive is somehow is joining several things that were in the past on European level interventions that are dated back in 80s and 90s and beginning of 2000. That are basically three pillars that are somehow considering air quality in general, in ambient air, and in industry, and in different environments. So the first pillar that is described on the top is Directive on Ambient Air Quality. This was established, as I said, in European Union in those 2-3 decades ago. And these are the directives that speak about these main pollutants that are listed in this slide, and that define systems and standards for measurements of those, let's say for PM 2.5, PM10, NO2, ozone, SO2, etc. So that those are setting the concentration levels and the limit values of those values. So then there is the second pillar, that is national emission reduction commitment that limits the total emissions in certain country about certain pollutants that are also listed here: SO2, NOx, VOCs, PM 2.5, and NH3. Those are important from the perspective of concentrations measured at background sites that are important for the long-term measurements that are important for the secondary pollutants that are later on formed in the atmosphere. And then we have the third pillar, which is source-specific emission standards that are related to transport, industries, different industries, and energy productions. Those are the industrial emission directives, the Euro standards for vehicles, eco-design rules, and other directives. Next slide, please. So as Jeff already mentioned this on his slides, so there is a significant amount of people that die because of the air pollution. And on this chart, we speak specifically about PM particulate matter concentration levels. So the directive somehow speaks about the reduction of those consequences of PM 2.5 emissions compared to measurements back in 2005. So as we can see from this chart, as of 2020, those emissions were already reduced for 45%, and there is a goal in sequences for 2030 to those emissions should be reduced even to minus 55% compared to year 2005. And the directive aims to reach the almost zero premature deaths by the year of 2050. And we will see, this directive should go into this direction, that should all these pollutants be somehow connected and measured and going to be reduced by 2050. Next slide, please. So how good we are when we consider air quality monitoring. On this slide, you have on the left a map of Europe and almost 1,800 sites. So these are the data that was taken from the European Environmental Agency reports. So current standard for PM 2.5 on annual basis is, so the limit value is 25 micrograms. In 2021, WHO published their guidelines for the reduction of PM 2.5 emissions and new limit values that are significantly smaller than those that are at the moment in European Union as a standard. And now, if you can see, just by limiting the values compared to, if we limit to 5 micrograms compared to current European standard of 25 micrograms, you see completely different image. Now, only for less than 5% of those stations or locations are within those limit values. Every other station is above that value. That means that there is a lot of work to be done, and a lot of measures that needs to be taken. But we have to find a way which one is better and which one is correct one. Next slide, please. So this is not the case only when we talk about fine particulates. It's also about ozone. It's also about NO2. Also about PM10, which are significantly bigger particles. So as we can see, and as we could also conclude, current European standard is not satisfactory. So we have to work better on this, and we have to have much greater goals to reach those considerably lower values. Next slide, please. So air pollution remains a big problem in European Union. It has a big impact on health. There is a great number of premature deaths that was estimated to about 300,000 premature deaths per year. There is a great social impact on different communities, different vulnerable groups like children, elder people, and has socioeconomically also affect and disadvantage of the goods that people are then are driven into. Yeah. So environmental impacts on the other side. So eutrophication, acidification of ecosystem in Mediterranean area. We saw this summer lots of problems with eutrophication, and this will also then impact on economy, especially countries that tourism is their great economy. So the main revenues are coming from tourism. So this will definitely impact also, will be direct impact on them. So there are some questions that are sent out to people in all European Union, to different countries. This is Eurobarometer that is done here and there on different topics. And in majority, people in Europe think that there is a big concern about air quality and the air that they breathe. So there is definitely lots of work to be done and needs to be done in coming years and decades. Next slide, please. So the directive is basically working on different directions. So on this slide, I somehow put in, let's say, several important things. So the goal is to have zero pollution levels by 2050. We have intermediate AQ standards, And we have an updated air quality standard, stricter limit values of different pollutants that are measured on fixed stations and elsewhere. There will be one new thing, regular review mechanism that will be done every 5 years. It's already started. The next one will be in 2028, where people in certain groups, and especially probably ministries of environment and those groups that are working on long-term measurements of those pollutants in each country, will do a review how we are doing in certain type of pollutants. So if there is an increase of PM 2.5 emissions or decrease of ozone and so on, and by this there will be a closed loop with the next target date that it's, as I said at the beginning, there is in 2030 a plan to reduce the emissions that will reduce the premature deaths by additional 10%. So those reviews will be active and have active feedback back to on general level, so that will also have the impact on the policymakers. What should be done, for example, reducing the traffic in certain locations, or let's say change the type of fuel for heating or producing energy and so on. So there is governance and enforcement, air quality plans for more effective preventive of exceedances, even going further away so that there will be no exceedances. This is, something that will be at the beginning, so we'll see how it will work. There is an improved enforceability, new provision on justice, on compensation and penalties that probably we didn't see. We heard about this probably from the United States, but it was not so developed, let's say, in Europe. And there should be more cross-border collaboration between European member states. When we check monitoring and assessment, there will be a refined approach of air quality monitoring, increased use of air quality modeling and indicative measurements. That means that there will be more stations possibly implemented into networks, not only super sites, which are mandatory somehow, but those who will be doing the simulations will be more somehow involved in the final decision where the stations should be, and what are the final conclusions and of those reports. And then additional information on representativeness on sampling points. That gives the power also to individuals and NGOs that will be able to probably promote locations where they think that emissions are increased, and that new locations, new sites for the permanent, for long-term measurements should be established. And what's most important, especially for us who are in this business, let's say, there are additional new pollutants added to be monitored in the long-term measurement stations that are ultrafine particulates, black carbon, and ammonia. So, and there is, of course, also information and communication. There is a big push for the up-to-date air quality information. The data will need to be reported on hourly basis and accessible to citizens. And there is also a plan to have some kind of information sent to the public about potential health impacts in case of increased values of PM and certain things. We probably, at least in where I'm based, we receive such kind of notifications during summer where there is increased concentration of ozone, and also some precautions are, sent out for the people who are maybe a little bit more, could be more affected to this. Next slide. So where to start and what are the next steps? as Jeff said, when monitoring black carbon, there is also an option to somehow detect different types of black carbon emissions. That means that we can detect what are the sources of those emissions. So on the left chart, so this is like PM 2.5 split, so that we can see in 2020, for example, on the right side, you have the pie chart that you see what are the main components of the PM that are charted here, and to see that the majority is not traffic, which is in many times treated as the biggest source of pollution, but in this case is residential combustion. And in Europe, and especially in certain parts of Europe, there is a big problem, especially in winter months, about residential combustion, individual houses, how they heat themselves. And this is probably, as we can see, the trends and the plan to reduce this part of this chart is especially focused on the residential combustion. It's definitely not something easy to be done, but there are tools, and we will also see in the next presentation how basically we can distinguish by monitoring black carbon, probably in combination with PM 2.5, and how we can allocate which pollution sources are the most dominant and definitely can affect the increase of PM 2.5 pollution and probably also something else. And I think that's all from my side at the moment. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, my turn. I'm Stig Hellebust. I'm going to talk about some of the work we have been doing in Ireland on black carbon studies. Can I have the next slide, please? So when I say we, I'm talking about our research group in the Centre for Research into Atmospheric Chemistry, which is based in the School of Chemistry at University College Cork in Ireland. It has been in existence for about 25 years now, so we have a fair bit of experience in atmospheric monitoring. Next slide, please. So we're talking about black carbon today, but I think it'd be interesting actually to take a look at what's called black smoke, because black carbon is now part, or is going to be, there's going to be a legal mandate for the monitoring of black carbon. But if we, in the last century, most of what we actually know about particulate pollution in the early to late parts of the last century comes from what was called monitoring of black smoke. And black smoke is essentially the same thing, but it's measured in a different way. And there are records going back quite far, and in Dublin they measured this in 1963 to 2009 in several locations in the city, and it was reported as monthly averages. And we can see in this graph here, if you go back to the 60s, that it reaches really very high levels. But what's also evident is that it's a very seasonal thing. So the winter months we get these high peaks, and then in the summer months it goes down to sort of a low level, and that low level has been fairly constant over the last 50 years. But it's the highs that change with the years. And I don't know why they stopped monitoring, but it's probably related to the fact that the 2008 directive that regulates air pollution in Europe doesn't mention black carbon, so there was no legal mandate maybe to continue these monitoring. Yeah, next slide, please. But looking back at the record of black smoke, we can see how different legislative changes have actually impacted on those levels. And the most dramatic one is the change that happened in 1990, when they introduced a ban on bituminous coal in Dublin, a smoky coal ban. So suddenly the winter highs were not as high anymore. This would have been related to reduction in burning of smoky coal for home heating, probably related to the introduction of gas as well. But next slide, please. So black smoke is measured on a filter, a collection of particulates on a filter, but it is measured. What's measured is the absorption of the light that is reflected through the filter. In the AethLometer instrument, what's measured is the absorption of the transmitted light. So it's a very related measurement, but it's not exactly the same. But in principle, then it is possible to estimate what the black carbon levels would have been going back with historical black smoke levels, and this conversion has been thoroughly studied. But what we see if we convert the annual averages of black smoke into estimated levels of black carbon, we can see the same trend, that we have a dramatic and gradual, well, actually not continuous reduction in black carbon. But what we also see, if we then compare that to more recent measurements, I think there should be another element there. If you click next slide, please. Yeah. If we compare this to measurements of black carbon a few years later, we can see that there is a continuous downward trend of black carbon in Dublin. So I mean, this is good news. Can I have the next slide, please? But it does, of course, depend on where we do the measurements. So what we're looking at here are the 4 seasons, the distribution of black carbon values in 2 locations in Dublin City. So Pearse Street, which is a city centre location, and University College Dublin, which is more suburban residential area. And we can see then through all seasons that the range of values and the average values in the suburban area are much lower than what we see in the city centre, where the levels can still reach up to 15 micrograms per cubic meter. So this would be this would have been probably different from the situation back in the 60s when residential areas would have been really heavily impacted. But it's clear anyway that that there is still a lot of work to be done in the city to reduce the black carbon levels. Now, we are then making the assumption that these levels in the city centre are high because that's where the traffic is. But the thing, can I have the next slide there, please? But the thing about the AethLometer is that it measures the absorption of light at several wavelengths, and this allows us to look at the wavelength dependence of that absorption. And what we're looking at here are the shape of that absorption spectrum for a range of different fuels. And what is most notable is that some fuels, or the emissions from certain type of combustion processes, will produce particles that absorb much more in the ultraviolet range than other fuels. And this is what allows us to use these measurements as for the source apportionment purpose. Essentially, can I have a next slide there, please? So essentially, the absorption is wavelength dependent, and the fitting parameter for that curve is it's an exponential curve. And what we're actually using to fit the curve is this exponent, this parameter alpha in the picture. And what it turns out is that if you burn biomass like wood, you're going to have a higher absorption in the UV range, which means that the shape of the absorption spectrum is going to be much more like what you see for the wood here in the left. And effectively, that parameter, the fitting parameter, is going to take on a greater value than it would for a fuel that produces black carbon that does not absorb so much in the UV range. It's important to bear in mind here that it's a 2-parameter model. So it does work very well when we can say we have two different fuels, but it is not quite as clear cut when we have a mixture like we have in Ireland. We have a much more complex mixture of solid fuels, but that's for another day. Can I have the next slide, please? So if we look at how this fitting parameter, because in the kilometer every measurement gives us a spectrum, and we get high temporal resolution here from these measurements, and every measurement will give us a measure of that fitting parameter for that particular point in time, that sample. And if we look at how those samples are distributed in terms of how this exponent, this fitting parameter, is distributed, we can see here in the light gray, the suburban location, that the range of values is much wider, and it reaches much higher values much more often, which means that the particulate pollution in that location is more influenced by emissions that can be attributed to say biomass burning and fuel rather than fossil fuels. Whereas in the city center location, we can see that that distribution is much more narrow, and it is centered on much lower values of this fitting parameter, which does indicate that the location is much more impacted by fossil fuel combustion as in traffic. So it's a really useful way of looking at things, because we get some indication of the chemical nature of the particulate pollution, which we can use then to start estimating what are the main contributions. Can I have the next slide? So that was Dublin. We have done a lot of work in small towns as well. Ireland has a lot of towns with populations maybe between 15,000 and 25,000. And this smoky coal ban that I mentioned, that was introduced in Dublin in 1990, was of course then extended to other parts of the country. And it first came to the second city, Cork, and then it was extended to a range of other towns with certain populations. But in October 2022, it was effective in the entire country. So effectively, nobody is allowed to burn smoky coal in Ireland anymore, in the Republic of Ireland, so that is. So if we look at a town like this is a small town in the southeast of Ireland. Can I have the next slide, please? It's very easy to see that in a location like that, the main problem really is solid fuel burning. So the contribution from vehicle traffic in a location like that is really very small compared to the pollution that is coming from residential heating. So, so just from measuring black carbon, we can say something about what is the problem and how can we start dealing with this problem. Of course, you have to deal with heating solutions. Can I have the next slide? The good news is that we can see that from year to year there is actually improvements. So things are getting better, and there are partially perhaps the legislation is making an impact. But of course, it is definitely improving, which is good. Can I have the next slide there, please? But what's also interesting to look at is what is actually changing. So we could say that the overall levels of black carbon are decreasing. But if we look at these spectra and look at how the absorption changes in the particulates over the years, as in, let's look at what is happening to the UV range of the absorption. So the fitting parameter. This shows 3 winters histograms of the measured fitting parameters, the exponents, the angstrom exponents, to call it whatever. And what's clear from this is that there is a gradual, small but gradual change towards higher values, and a wider range of values. And this is telling us that the chemical nature of the particulates is changing. And that is because what has to be the cause of that is that the fuel mixture is changing. So people are burning different things. Can I have the next slide there, please? And then we have seen that black carbon can be a big fraction of the PM2.5. So if we can also see how that fraction is changing over the years. So if we just correlate black carbon with PM2.5 for different years, what's interesting is two things: is that the correlation is the quality of that correlation is decreasing actually. So in the last winter, the two parameters are less correlated than they were 5 years ago. And also the fraction of black carbon that is, or the fraction of PM2.5 that is black carbon is also decreasing. So there are some interesting things happening here. There are some real changes. And they appear to be related to fuel mixture, and the changing fuel mixture is possibly related to legislation, is possibly related to cost, but it's teaching us something about the dynamics of the situation. What is also interesting is how the correlation is changing. So the black carbon has a less direct influence on the PM2.5 than it would have had in the past. So I think it's just worth pointing out how useful it is to have these combined measurements of black carbon and PM2.5. And I can have the next slide there, please. So I really welcome this change in the directive, that we will now get more of a legal mandate to monitor black carbon again, because black smoke used to be the main parameter that was measured for air quality. But now, with that legal change, hopefully we will see a wider network of black carbon monitoring, and this will enhance the, air quality management, but it will also give us some really interesting research opportunities. And this accelerometer model is a 2-parameter model, and I don't think the last version of this model has been seen yet. I do hope that we can see a development of that into a model that might actually work in a mixed fuel environment as well. Yeah, I think next slide. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stig. Thank you, everybody else. I'm just a bit conscious of time, so I will try and be quick through my slides to give us a little bit of time to answer some of the questions at the end. So I'm Lee Swanson. I represent Clarity Movement, and we are a specialist in providing low-cost sensors for air pollution, and we are trying to empower organizations and individuals to reduce air pollution. Next slide, please, Ryan. So how do we go about this? So we have developed a sensing as a service. And what does that mean? So we provide pretty much everything that you would need to be able to take measurements. So we provide the hardware, which we have the Clarity Node and add-on modules, the Clarity Cloud, where you can view and download the data, and then the Clarity expert support. So the back end sort of support that we provide after that. Next slide, please, Ryan. So the Clarity Node S, this is the most popular sensor that we provide. We now have sensors deployed in over 70 countries around the world. It's built around being solar powered and cellular connection, so it provides great flexibility in sighting the instrument, and it's very easy to install. The vast majority of customers carry out the installation themselves, with it taking less than 10 minutes. And it's a weatherproof, so it's IPX3 rated, and in the UK it's also M certified, covering the PM, and it's FCC and CE certified. And it measures PM, so PM 2.5, and NO2 from the same module. Next slide, Ryan. So from the Clarity module, we also wanted to offer customers additional components that they wanted to measure. So we have a series of add-on modules that connect to the Clarity node. So the Clarity node handles all the communications and in some instances the power. So we've got the wind module for wind speed, wind direction, and ambient temperature and relative humidity, the ozone module, and the black carbon module. Next slide, Ryan. So just a little bit about black carbon. So some of the main sources of where black carbon is coming from. So from waste burning, 15%, road transport, 31%, and then the biggest percentage is residential commercial institutions. So you've got your wood burning stoves and like your commercial activities. Next slide, Ryan. So what makes the black carbon module unique? So Clarity, so there's 4 pillars. So ease of deployment, seamless data access, best-in-class data, and co-location. So I'll talk about the ease of deployment. So the next slide, right? So Clarity has taken the AethLabs module and we've sort of packaged it and made it waterproof. And when paired with the Clarity node, again, it's very easy to deploy and it works off the cellular, and it can also be solar powered as well. So you can see the module there. The black carbon module requires a slightly bigger solar power, but yeah, it can be deployed again in like 10 to 15 minutes. It's completely weatherproof. So that's what Clarity has done with the AethLabs module. So we've made it weatherproof. It's got a robust pump that can last for up to 2 years, continuous operation. The solar panel only requires 40 minutes of direct sunlight. And if there is no sunlight, the unit will continue operating for up to 14 days. There are some variables that can affect that, but it can continue operating for up to 14 days. And I've already mentioned it works off cellular connection. So it's not requiring Wi-Fi connection. It really is very flexible on the siting locations. And I know Jeff has already mentioned about the filter tapes. Next slide, Ryan. So the seamless data access. So this is how you can look at the data and how you access the data. So Clarity has their own private dashboard. So this is sort of the one that you can see kind of on the left of your screen there. And here you can see all of the module data for Clarity. So for the black carbon, you'll see your total black carbon concentration and the source apportionment. If you wanted to, you can also access the data using the API and have the data directly in real time up to your own database or your own like public facing website. Next slide, right? So the best in class data quality and like measurement quality, I'll call it. So the next slide, right? So we co-located the black carbon in our lab in Berkeley, and you can see that there's great alignment there with the black carbon module against a co-located black carbon module. We've got an R² value of 0.93. We also wanted to show that we get good correlation in other locations as well. So next slide, Ryan. So we've got a co-location there in Denver. Again, an R² value of 0.92. And next slide, right? And then one in Florida. So again, another R² value of 0.92. So at the moment, we only really have the black carbon module, but it's relatively new. So we only really have the data at the moment for the US. Next slide, right? And now to talk about the co-location of the PM2.5 NO2 and black carbon. So this is an example of what the data will look like. So you've got the black carbon there, but it's what's causing these peaks. So you've got the peaks in the morning. So this is taken from a period from September, just for a few days. So you've got some early morning peaks on the left-hand side and some higher peaks on the right-hand side. So it's if you then compare this with PM2.5, so if you go to the next slide, right? When you overlap the PM2.5 data, you can see that it correlates. So the black carbon, when the black carbon goes up or when the PM 2.5 goes up, the black carbon and or the PM 2.5 also goes up. So the next one, right? So when you look at this coupled with the source apportionment, then you can align this up and say the early morning is from the biomass burning, and then the peaks on the left is from biomass burning, and the peaks on the right is from fossil fuel combustion or road traffic sources. Next slide, Brian. So yeah, so this is the source apportionment. So you can see again on the left peak is from wildfire smoke. So 75% biomass, 25% fossil fuels, and then the peaks on the right is all from fossil fuels, so from traffic. And then when you dig into this a little bit deeper, you sort of look at the causes for this, so the wildfire event. So if you click on the next, this is from the New York Times. There was an article written about the wildfires going over the Bay Area in Berkeley. So now that you've dug into a little bit deeper, you can be very confident that the peak on the left is actually caused from wildfire, and it's that's the main sources of it. So, yep, next slide, Ryan. So a case study from the RAC. So this is in Australia. So they've got 20 sites deployed across the town, and it's looking at the impacts of traffic that have on black carbon. So, yep, next slide, Ryan. So you can see here that there's diurnal changes in the black carbon. So there's two different periods. So they've taken one from the 1st to the 11th of August, and one from the 12th to the 20th of August. And there's slightly different peaks and troughs in these. So the one from the 11th, well, up to the 11th of August is wildfire impacted. And then the one on the right, the 12th to 20th, there's no wildfire peaks. So, but you can see in the early morning, on the particular one on the right, the early morning peaks is probably going to be attributed to traffic, commuter traffic, and likewise to the peak on the right. So next slide, Ryan. Yeah, so this is what I was just talking about there. So when you compare it with the NO2 values, then you can quite confidently say that the peaks on the left is well, there's different peaks here from between the weekdays and the weekends. So the peaks on the left-hand side, when you compare it with the NO2, you can quite clearly see that you've got some really high peaks in the early hours, in the early morning, but you don't get those same peaks at the same times in the weekends. So again, you can probably conclude that this is from commuter traffic. Yes, Ryan? So there, yeah, just to recap everything. So the Clarity node with the black carbon, so it's very easy to deploy, and it's for outdoor monitoring. The seamless data access with the cellular connection again provides greater flexibility in siting locations. The data has been compared against reference monitoring stations and is consistent. And by using the collocation and comparing data PM 2.5, NO2, and black carbon, it can help you conclude on your source apportionment and where the pollution sources are coming from. Yep, right. And this is a bit of a cost comparison between the different units. So you've got the McGee, the Met1, and the Met1 black carbon modules there. This is comparing against the Clarity black carbon module, and the cost savings that are associated along the bottom there. Yes, right. And yeah, if you've got any additional questions after this, if you think of some questions that you wanted to ask that you didn't quite get around to asking or didn't get answered, then by all means email any of the panelists or anyone from Clarity. And yeah, we'll try and address some of the questions in the Q&As that have already been answered. Already been asked, sorry. So we've got one. Do you want to ask the questions? Right, I'll go through the questions. So we've got one. Should the correction methods be applied to all data? I don't know if they're talking about ambient data or internal data, but yeah, I think you're probably best to answer that one, Jeff.
Yeah, I think that may have actually been a follow-up question to an AE51 specific request for some support on loading compensation for that device, which doesn't have the same automatic loading compensation and as the MA350 and the Clarity BC module. So I think we'll probably take that one off of the call.
Great. I see you're already answering the one about is there any other methodology to estimate BC using PM ration ration for, so you're already answering that one. So we've been monitoring PM 2.5 in household level, where the major source is biomass combustion for cooking. Is biomass combustion a major source of BC? Is it a good idea to monitor black carbon at household level? How do we differentiate between PM 2.5 and black carbon? Who would be best to answer that one? Probably you again, with it being indoor monitoring.
Let's see, give me 1 second. Okay. Biomass combustion, a major source of BC. So this is interesting. In terms of, if you think about smoke, oftentimes if you see biomass burning, it's a pretty inefficient source. So you'll see a lot of white smoke, maybe some brown smoke because it's organic. So those sources will definitely show up much more strongly in the shorter wavelengths. And Stig's presentation, he mentioned about some of the more organic sources in his research and measurements. And so you can definitely distinguish between those sources, and there will be a very strong signal in the shorter wavelengths of the Clarity BC module. But in terms of it being a major source of BC, I think that one of the first slides that I had on in my presentation, I'm about to post a link to the paper for Pratima's question, preceding question. But in that paper, it does talk about these different sources from transportation, residential, heating, industry, power plants actually being a very small amount of BC emission, and agriculture versus wildfire. So according to that paper, and I think recent events, I think that wildfires are becoming, and biomass combustion are becoming larger sources. As far as for cooking, it may be a very significant source in depending on the region. So depending on the geography, if there's lots of mountains, if there's wood burning in a valley, for example, then that smoke can actually sit in the valley in winter and actually be a really significant health impact for the people living in that area. So there's probably it's probably very fuel and combustion method and location dependent is what I would say. And there's lots of literature out there that I can't recall off the top of my head. Maybe Stig has some other thoughts on that too. I don't know.
Yeah, well, in general, cooking is a major source of PM, indoor air as well, and cooking aerosol, organic aerosol from cooking has been identified as a fairly big source actually in cities around Europe and other parts of the world. Whether the majority of it is BC or not, I mean, there will be a lot of organic materials, amines and things like that from the cooking, and secondary organic aerosols that will be forming from the emissions from cooking, but the BC will be from the fuel that you're using to prepare the food. So if you have an open fire inside, then you're going to have black carbon emissions. Yeah, but so like Jeff says, it depends on your appliance, on your stove, how much. I mean, the efficiency of combustion and all that. But yes, biomass combustion will produce BC, and if you're burning indoors, even if it's in a stove, you're going to have increased levels of BC inside as well, I would say. But the organic part of the organic aerosol from the cooking may be much more dominant. That could be situation specific.
Great. There's another question, but I'll leave that for Jeff or Ivan to answer, which was, Is the A151 model still in production? I'll leave you guys to sort of answer that one, like typing the question to it. There's one about the compatibility, but yeah, we'll contact them. About how the savings. So this is based on the first year costs of the instruments. So it might not include everything, but it's based on the average usage. So as was mentioned in Jeff's presentation, the frequency of the tapes might change depending on the concentrations, and the higher the concentrations, the more tapes you'll need, which would obviously increase the cost. But this is based on average usage, and the savings are based on the first year of usage of the instruments. How accurate is the source apportionment calculation in mixed environments? Are there data that could help better distinguish? I think that one might be for you again, Jeff.
Let's see. I'm trying to answer questions while listening.
Yeah,
as
sorry.
well. Sorry, which are we at which post? I apologize.
So Grant, the one at the end. So how accurate is the source apportionment calculation in mixed environments? Are there data that could help better distinguish?
So I'm sure Stig has lots more experience in terms of actually thinking about corrections for source apportionment than I do. But you will find in the literature that so the source apportionment in the BC1 module is basically equivalent to what's done in the Rachmont A33, and that was one of the main requirements of the French approval, the French network campaign that we did to show equivalency between our technology and the McGee A33 devices. And so the method is, like Stig said, is a two-component model. It's a nice way to do some rough distinction between these different sources. But for example, there are other things that absorb in the shorter wavelength. So if you're indoors and you're smoking a cigarette, or someone is smoking a cigarette, that will also show up and absorb in the UV and blue. So there are certain assumptions that have to be made. There are chemical and laboratory techniques that can be done to better calibrate site-specific coefficients for determining what is biomass burning and what is traffic emissions, using markers of like anhydrous sugars like levoglucosan, monosan, things like that. That's chemistry, not really my area of expertise. If Stig wants to comment on that, I certainly welcome it.
Yeah. Sorry, what was the question?
So how accurate is source apportionment calculation in mixed environments?
Yeah, well, we have been struggling with that question actually for a long time because, like I said, we have in Ireland quite a mixed fuel environment. This model was developed in, I suppose, on the European continent, where the main fuel for heating is wood. So it works very well when you have a sort of a clear dominant fuel. But in Ireland, we burn coal, we burn peat, we burn turf and wood. And because if you think, well, coal is a fossil fuel, but so it's classified as a fossil fuel, but it's also it's a solid fuel for heating. So the model tries to distinguish between basically traffic and heating emissions, and then you throw coal into the mix, which is fossil fuel for heating, and we don't have a good handle really on how to incorporate that in a two-parameter model. We need an extra parameter to actually, because this fitting parameter that is actually what enables us to separate the two contributions. It will only separate two contributions. So effectively, what we are doing is that we're rolling all the solid fuels into one, which means that the model at best is an estimate, but it's a good estimate because we can take other information into account, as in the time of day, and we know when we can expect the traffic peaks and when the residential heating is going to dominate the picture and all that. So it's so I wouldn't say it's an accurate model, but I say it gives a really good indication in a mixed fuel environment. course, it is easier when you have a clear cut to component. So I think it's well worth developing this model into and perhaps seeing if we can extract more useful information from the raw data that can inform what are the appropriate parameters to use, because you have to actually make an assumption to make this model work. You have to assume the fitting parameter for fossil fuel is this, and then the fitting parameter for your solid fuel is another value, and then those two values are fixed in the model. But the reality is that those two parameters, that pair, isn't going to be valid everywhere. So it's really quite a location specific model. But it's a good model.
And then, yeah, I'm just very conscious of the time. So what I'll do is we'll just do this as the last question, and then we'll let everybody go. So what is the performance in places with ultra very low concentrations?
I can try to answer that. So focusing on the BC1 module, the Clarity node integrated technology. So we've done a lot of work to compare the outdoor implementation of the MA350 technology in the BC1 module that's offered with the node. And the resolution of the instrument is obviously quite good, down to, maybe the resolution is just a few nanograms. In terms of actual performance, the main issue is going to be kind of environmental stability. We've spent a lot of time both doing things like creating a heat shield so that solar radiation doesn't directly impact the instrument. Lots of instrumentation out there always has some temperature dependency, and so you'll have compensations or adjustments or things like that to try to offset those effects. And then the enclosure also has a layer of insulation to further protect it, to slow down any kind of changes in the environment. And so at low concentrations, if we were to define those at, say, like less than 500 nanograms per cubic meter, it really depends on what you're looking at. So, if you're trying to determine what the background concentration is over a season, 3 months, then, that's probably very easy to do. If you're trying to distinguish between, a very small incremental change in black carbon from a distant source versus your background, that becomes harder and harder. So I would say it really depends on your measurement objective in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, because there are trade-offs in sensitivity as far as the, how long you're measuring for, how much flow you have through the instrument. I mean, there are a few adjustments to the device that can allow it to be kind of optimized for different measurement scenarios or different scientific objectives. So that's probably a conversation that the Clarity team, or I'm always happy to provide feedback on, could probably comment on. And I know that there's some of those examples of the AE33 comparisons that Lee showed. If you look at those more in detail, you will see kind of what the background concentrations are, and they actually are pretty low in some of those locations. Just a couple hundred nanograms per cubic meter. So.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, as I said before, well, it's been asked as well. So the recording of this presentation will be made available. I think the slides will also be available to download as well. And yeah, thank you to the panelists for taking part in the webinar, and thank you everybody for sort of joining us for this. Okay.